Thank you, Mark, for that. A number of things that he said, prayer, that's going to be one of the first points that I make. And I'm trying to find my AirPlay. What would that be? It's usually up there. But I do need to say something about Mark. He has a great speaking voice, doesn't he? Yeah, he's pretty good looking too. He has a voice for radio. I have a face for radio. You didn't have to agree so quickly. Is it GBC Sanctuary? Awesome. Hey, that's me. Very good. Let's see if I can negotiate this pretty reasonably. All right, the handout that you all received, there's two sides to it. I'm going to start on the black and white side, and then we'll mention the color side. I am the moderator of the Finger Lakes Baptist Association, which is our area Southern Baptist Convention of New York, association of churches. There are 19 churches. One of the things I love to share with people about the Finger Lakes Baptist Association is of those 19 churches, only 10 of them are English speaking. Think about that for a moment. 19 churches, 10 English speaking. I don't see anyone here from the non-English speaking convention churches, association churches, which is one of our greatest barriers that we're constantly trying to overcome in regard to our association. But we want to add one more language to that. We did have a deaf church plant attempt a few years ago. That did not come to fruition, and we realized the need for a new deaf church plant. Why is that? Well, first of all, as you see in your handout, the Rochester area, these are 2012 statistics. They're the most recent I could find. 19,438 deaf or hard of hearing individuals under the age of 65 in Rochester. 23,236 over the age of 65. Now you might be wondering why they divided that way. Well, because of the process of becoming elderly and losing hearing, they separate those two because those who are under 65 are more often than not part of what's identified as deaf culture. And notice I didn't do it well on this slide, but at the top, deafness is with a capital D. There is deaf culture with a capital D, and then there's deafness, a descriptor with the small letter D. Deaf people identify in their own culture and therefore give it a capital letter to identify it as a direct cultural piece of our society. The reason why is because we have a school there. NTID is the National Technical Institute for the Deaf. It is at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Oftentimes it is a 2-year program. All of the programs at NTID are interpreted, and then oftentimes there are interpreters brought into RIT to assist in that. So that is why Rochester is literally the most populous city in the United States of America for the deaf. Let me stay on that for just a minute. As we consider that we have the largest population for the deaf, I'm going to get to this in a few minutes, the reality is, though, there is not one deaf of deaf congregation in the city of Rochester, in the greater Rochester area. That means that there are numerous people not hearing the gospel, and that's what I want to build on as we go today. But what's maybe more important about that reality is that in deaf lifestyles, notice these points. There's a higher incidence of physical abuse victimization, sexual abuse victimization, drug and alcohol abuse and addictions, self-identification of being gay, lesbian, or bisexual. And those people are not well educated on human sexuality. That comes out mostly in the fact that their incidence of HIV and AIDS is disproportionate to the general population of the Rochester area and the United States of America. And we could tell numerous stories that my wife and I have personally heard on the topic of what happens in many deaf schools. If you talk to people who have worked at RIT, NTID, there are what most people would consider bizarre incidences of deaf sexuality publicly. They don't hear, and because they don't hear, two deaf people might engage in a sexual activity right in a stairwell in the school. And people will stumble upon this, and, many of us would have probably a extreme reaction to that, but that's common in deaf culture. So this just gives you a point of where that culture stands, which is a consequence of the lack of the Christianity in their culture. 93% of deaf in America have no contact with a church. So if we just assimilate that back to the 20,000 people in general under the age of 65, deaf and hard of hearing, 93% of those 20,000 people have no access or no contact with a church. Less than 2% of the deaf have an active relationship with Jesus Christ. New York, by the way, it's 4%. Just wanted to point that out to you. The state of New York, the evangelistic contact of churches in the state of New York is less than 4%. In the deaf population, it's less than 2%. And so when you look at the city of Rochester, that 2% is probably an exaggeration. Deaf community is the third, sometimes considered fourth largest unreached people group with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Less than 300 individuals are serving in full-time deaf ministry worldwide as we speak. In 2005, 42 out of 65 deaf churches in America did not have a pastor. And less than 5% of churches in the U.S. offer deaf outreach. On your handout, I gave you the link to a website that has a lot more statistics than this. I just pulled these out to highlight them, to share them with you. You can go to those sites and find that information. Now, there is good news. There's an organization, there's a man named John Weibel who started a website and is the North American Mission Board consultant for deaf church planting. And he made a website, deafchurchplanting.com, and I just want to pull this up for you briefly so you can get a peek at it and understand what that website looks like. I'll try to expand it a little bit so you can see it a little better. So, yeah, this is the website, deafchurchplanting.com. I encourage you, when we're done, to go see it. The color side of your sheet has one of the pages is this page. This page is published by the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. One of the great things about the International Mission Board is they are planting churches worldwide, and they're doing an excellent job. And this is not to condemn, but to explain, the North American Mission Board is not doing the job the International Mission Board is doing. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to encourage them in that. But he puts some of these facts out here. 1,500 deaf people die every single day. These deaf are plunged into dark, Christless eternity. 1,500 people a day dying without Christ in the deaf population. One of the really interesting things you'll find on this website is the difference between hearing language and deaf language. The syntax of American Sign Language is significantly different than English syntax. And so you'll be reading through this website, and I don't know if you're like me, but when I read websites and I see misspellings and wrong grammar and things like that, it's like, okay, you put that out for the world to see. Could you please correct it? That's not the case on this deaf website. This is a person interpreting from his ASL thinking to English thinking. And he's putting it out there as best as he possibly can. So when you see it, understand that's part of being in deaf culture, trying to communicate with English-speaking culture. It doesn't match up one-to-one. The syntax of ASL, just to give you a brief description, is that it's more like Spanish language. In that, in English, we'll talk about the green car. In Spanish, they would say it's the car green. And in ASL, it's similar to that. And then there's parts of ASL that you have to really just do much great describing to get to the point of what you're trying to explain. And then there's others that are just so brief that it just like, boom, it makes sense. It's a visual language. It's a verbal language, meaning it's active. Just to give you one brief example of that, if I said the sentence, the squirrel climbed the tree. The squirrel climbed the tree, 6 words. That's it. Let me say it again, 6 words. That's the squirrel climbed the tree. So you can abbreviate it that quickly in certain forms of ASL, but other forms, you have, like Sharon interprets for me every Sunday because our daughter is deaf. When our daughter's at the service, Sharon interprets for our daughter, and she sometimes will go, well, you know, Dad, he said this. And just leave it at that because it was going to take so long to explain all of that. Oh, there's another thing. I'm standing here, I'm signing, and my computer's blocking people over here. The microphone, that is blocking people over here. If you're at a deaf service, they might have a stand like this. They have it very low, and they're signing above it. Now, here's another aspect, and I'll just jump down here for a minute. If I'm here, and I'm signing to you, and I'm trying to talk to you, and I shut off my voice, and I'm just... Some of you, I saw you. What's he doing over there? I can't see him that well. There's a brand new deaf church built in Brentwood, Tennessee. Brentwood Baptist Church built a deaf worship center. Every row is 13 inches higher than the row in front of it. And they have the chairs offset at 30-inch centers so that everyone can see the speaker. And they have a sound system underneath the floor that vibrates the floor because they enjoy music. As a matter of fact, our daughter, we can hear her coming to our house well before she arrives. Her speakers are going boom, boom, boom in her car because she has her implant on and she doesn't understand the words all the time, but she just enjoys the stimulation and the sound. Well, that's part of deaf culture, and so in that sanctuary, they have speakers under the floor vibrating. And if you go to Brentwood Baptist Church Deaf Ministry, you'll find that. Anyway, back to John Weibel's site here. Deaf church planting, we see that the deaf and hard of hearing in America, the average attendance here is 2,320 people a Sunday nationally. There's 400,000 deaf and hard of hearing in the United States estimated. 2,300 out of 400,000 are regularly attending churches. We are Southern Baptists, and this is a Southern Baptist website. The question is, are we Southern Baptists reaching the deaf of our cities? The answer is no, John declares. Do we have enough deaf churches in North America? Well, you've already heard that. No, we don't. How many churches exist within the United States of America? 187, and you might as well put that to 186 because he was still counting the deaf church that we had tried to start a few years ago that did not make it. This is a point I'd like to get to. Can an interpreter fill the gap? As I said, my wife interprets for our daughter. And my wife is not a professional certified interpreter. She does her best. We were talking about this just the other day. She signs some English. She signs some Pidgin, PSE, some ASL that she's able to, capture through the many years. Jocelyn's 28 now, and we've only known for 26 years that she's deaf. So she's been interpreting the best she can because we've often lived in a rural area, and living in a rural area, there's very few deaf people. So we're the only communication that she has with people that can understand her. So it's hard when you have an interpreter. I mean, some of you understand interpretation. Those of you who studied a foreign language, there's some really bizarre interpretations that happen from one language to another. And I'll give you some individual examples personally if you want to talk to me about those later, but it's just, you can say something in one language and try to put it word for word in another language, and it's like, no. As a matter of fact, no, that was offensive what you just said to me. So think about those things. He puts in there why they use the capital deaf instead of the small deaf. I just want to encourage you. I'm giving you some resources that you can study this more and look into it. This quote from the Guide to Deaf Ministry at the very end of the page that I showed you, Deanne Sampley says, a study was conducted among the deaf churches and interpreted ministries in one mainline denomination. The findings were astounding. Of all the spiritual conversions in this denomination, 90% came from the 30 deaf churches and only 10% from the 200 interpreted ministries. This is an issue of evangelism, that when you're evangelizing people, the gospel needs to be in the heart language of the individual who's, in our case of deafness, seeing their language. So it's very hard to evangelize a native Spanish-speaking person when you're speaking to them in English. Well, the exact same is true when you're trying to talk or interpret to a deaf person. They don't get as clear of a presentation of the gospel as they might otherwise have if it was a native ASL presenter going to the native ASL audience. So please peruse that website later and check it out. I want to get back then to why a deaf pastor is needed. As you saw in the statistics, very few deaf pastors in the United States of America. Most congregations don't have a deaf pastor. There's a language barrier. I can communicate in sign language with the average person who is deaf. I don't use ASL. There are a few people that saw me sign and thought I was deaf, found out I was hearing, and walked away from me. There's other people that look at me and go, boy, he's so stupid, he's hearing. And actually, there's a sign for people who think in a hearing mode. This is being hearing means you're talking. Well, they put up here because your brain is hearing. And that's what they'll say about certain people who try to move into their culture and engage them, and they figure out, oh, no, you're not part of our culture. The deaf can't learn to hear, as you've hopefully all figured that out by now. You can't learn to hear. Deafness typically is permanent. There are now more modern solutions. Jocelyn herself got a cochlear implant, and the cochlear implant helps her, but it doesn't make her hearing. She has a very good friend who's bilaterally implanted, and she hears very well, but she is still hard of hearing. The implant oftentimes, more often than not, moves deaf people to become hard of hearing people, not hearing people. So you can't learn to hear the language. And like I said earlier, there's things lost in the interpretation, and I don't know how much time I have. I could tell you the frog story, and maybe you'd laugh. I'll come back to it maybe if I have time at the end. You can tell me, Jason, if I have time. Deaf culture is a semi-closed culture. And what I mean by that is deaf people don't just show up at a hearing event because they don't know what's going on. This is zero, meaning nothing. This is your mind. There's just nothing going on there for them. It's like, why should I show up to an event where no one can communicate with me? I can speech read some, what we used to call lip reading. They call it speech reading now. I can speech read some, but if you're in a circle, as most of us do this, and there's a group of people, usually there's 2 or 3 conversations happening in a circle of people. Well, can you read 3 different people's speech all at the same time? Absolutely not. So deaf culture is a semi-closed culture. They want to interact with people of their own culture because they know they can communicate with them well. And we see this in the Hispanic and Spanish-speaking cultures as well, that whenever there's a group of Spanish-speaking people, and a group of English-speaking people, the Spanish people all congregate together and the English-speaking people all congregate together. It's because it's where we're comfortable. I was in an event recently, and Sharon says, oh, yeah, she says, you're going to come home tired, because I was talking to a couple where the husband's deaf and the wife is hearing, and she doesn't sign very well yet. And my brain has to read his sign and think enough in sign language that I can communicate to him and her at the same time. So I'm doing what's called SimCom, talking and signing at the same time, which, as I already said, I have to switch in my sign the syntax to ASL while I'm talking in English at the same time, and it's not possible. You just can't do it. So that's why it's a semi-closed culture. That's why a deaf pastor is needed, because these people need the language. They need this truth of the gospel in their language. So there's support needed for this, and we as the Finger Lakes Association haven't officially, but we're working very much toward supporting a deaf pastor coming to Rochester, and we will need to financially support them. Typically, the North American Mission Board will support a pastor for up to, you said you planted a church, right? And what was it, got 5 years of support maybe from NAM?
Back in the days of 2 years.
2 years of support from NAM. Now, if you start a church and you have 2 years to get the church started, and that means the national organization is financially helping you, the goal is that they are no longer helping you and your congregation is supporting you. Now, I put this statistic there that 50 is a mega church in the deaf culture. Now, how many congregations can survive with a congregation of 50 people and support a full-time pastor to be ministering to them? Not many. Our church has the blessing of we have a parsonage, which then means they don't have to pay me quite as much, which means then I can function as a full-time pastor in a small congregation. But few congregations can do that. When you consider planting, they don't have an established building. They don't have an established congregation. And it's hard to meet deaf people and then share the gospel with them and then get them to the point where they're ready to actually start supporting the congregation themselves. And many deaf are underemployed or unemployed. And so starting a deaf church in Rochester is not, well, let's just call NAM and have them do their normal thing. They can't, the church will fail quickly. And so we're going, as the Finger Lakes Association and some of the other people I'm communicating with, we're going to have to pull this together and make a new model to start a deaf church in the United States in Rochester. So my current vision for the FBLA and the deaf church plant, and I believe that the other leaders of the FLBA are with me on this. First of all, as Mark so well shared, the first thing we do is pray. So I'm asking for your prayer support to lift up a work of the Holy Spirit to bring a pastor to Rochester and fully support this pastor in his work. There will be a meeting next week, October 21st. I invited John Weibel. He will be there. 2 leaders from the International Mission Board. And through John, he gave me a connection with the crew leader at NTID, crew being what used to be Campus Crusade for Christ. That leader is going to be, we have hired 2 interpreters because we have 3 deaf people and maybe 5 hearing people in the room. And so we're going to need at least 2 interpreters there so that the deaf people in the room are able to understand what we're talking about. We're going to be able to understand what they're talking about. And so for that meeting, our plan for the meeting is to pray, explore what will this look like, identify a pastor. That's probably not going to happen at the meeting, although they've already given me some indication that they have an idea of a few people. We're going to assess and commission from NAM this pastor once we've identified him. Some people from NAM will be at this meeting, NAM being North American Mission Board, and I'm going to be twisting their arms because they can't go with the traditional model in a deaf church. And that's why I invited the International Mission Board, because they've done it. They're doing it, and they're successful at it. So, hey, NAM, why don't you listen to the people that know what they're doing? That's going to be my attitude at this meeting. And then, hopefully we're going to begin the work. We hope to provide space at the FLB office for this church plant. We do have an office in Rochester. We might renovate that space. We're exploring what to do with the space. Well, here's an opportunity that space might go to good ministry. All that we're paying on it is utilities right now. It is a free 100-year lease that we as the FLBA have a space, so that seems to me to be a reasonable option for it. But again, this is all up to God. And then finally, the local churches will need to provide prayer and financial support. And that's part of my presentation here. And that doesn't mean you have to be FLBA. It means that all churches, when they realize just the brief description I gave you of the need in Rochester, that the Holy Spirit would move in you, that you could be a part of that support process. So how much time do I have left, Jason? Did I use it up? A minute. So I got to tell you this story. And a deaf person told me this story. He said that there was a scientist one day, and he was a hearing scientist. And the hearing scientist was doing experimentation on frogs. And so he had a frog, and he placed a frog on a line, and he stood behind the frog, and he coaxed the frog, and he yelled, "Jump, frog, jump!" And the frog jumped, and he measured, and the frog had jumped 4 feet. Scientist says, "Well, great." And he writes down in his observation manual, "Frogs with 4 legs jump 4 feet." Well, he amputated one of the legs of the frog. And he puts the frog back on the line, and he says, "Jump, frog, jump." And the frog jumped. And he measured, and the frog had jumped 3 feet. And so he writes down, "Frogs with 3 legs jump 3 feet." Next stage, he amputates another leg. Frog with 2 legs sets it on the line. "Jump, frog, jump." And the frog jumps. And the frog jumps, and he measures 2 feet. Frog with 2 legs jumps 2 feet. One more time, amputates the last, there's one more leg. One-legged frog on the line. "Jump, frog, jump." The frog jumps, he measures, writes down his observations. A frog with 1 leg jumps 1 foot. Finally, he amputates the final leg of the frog and puts it on the line. And he says, "Jump, frog, jump." Nothing happens. "Jump, frog, jump." Nothing happens. He gets his manual out and writes his observation. A frog with no legs is deaf. Now, that story can be used in such a wide variety of concerns for deaf people. It is the fact that we don't understand deafness as hearing people because we've lived our entire lives being able to communicate. When Jocelyn was 18 months old was the first we were told that she's deaf. And so immediately we took sign language classes. And after taking the first couple of sign language classes, I sat Jocelyn down at the breakfast table, and she's across the table from me. And I had an apple and I had a banana. And I went like this with her, universal sign language of which one of these 2 things do you want? And she pointed at the banana. And I put the banana aside, and I held up the apple, and I said, "Sign apple." The few sign that I knew, your knuckle, first knuckle in your cheek, apple. She signed apple. I pick up the banana, and I said, "Sign banana." Banana like you're peeling the banana. And Jocelyn signs banana. And so I peeled the banana, started the peeling of the banana. I hand it to her. She eats the banana. The very next morning, I'm asleep. And you know when you're sleeping, you sense sometimes when there's someone else in the room? The cute little face is looking at me from the side of the bed. Jocelyn went to breakfast with Daddy. Up until then, we had been talking to her and she didn't understand. But that morning, banana had meaning. How many deaf people go through life and you tell them the gospel and it has no meaning? We need the gospel to 20,000 deaf people in Rochester. Please pray. And please, if you're able, join us in that ministry. And thank you for your time.